very much for being here today. My name is Christopher Shays. I'm chairman of the Government Reform and Oversight Subcommittee called Human Resources, and we're here to, after the full committee has adopted our report on Gulf War illnesses. This was a report that was done during the last 19 months about the so-called Gulf War syndrome. We had 11 substantive hearings, and I'm here with my colleagues from the committee, Mr. Towns, Mr. Snowberger, and Mr. Sanders, in this bipartisan report. I just want to make a few general comments and then have my colleagues comment to the dais and just make some comments and then respond to any questions you might have. This report, we've given you just the summary of it, has 18 findings. They're substantive findings, and we have 18 substantive recommendations. In some cases, 3 or 4 of the findings add and support one of the recommendations, or 2. They don't necessarily line up number for number. We made a determination clearly that sadly our soldiers were not being listened to by either the VA or DOD, and so frankly we listened. And sadly we found that when it came to diagnosis and treatment and research, that the VA and DOD and the bureaucracies in general have a tin ear and a very cold heart and a very closed mind. We've made 3 significant recommendations. I would highlight, we've made 18 significant, but 3 I would highlight. One, that we would enact as a matter of law the presumption that known toxic exposures cause certain chronic symptoms. The challenge we have is that the VA and the DOD don't have records. They don't have records that would support our veterans' position, and it's a very convenient position for the bureaucracy and the government to be in. They say to the veteran, prove your illness, and all the documents that could prove it have either been lost or actually destroyed by the government. Secondly, we would create or designate a lead agency separate from the VA and the DOD to provide overall direction to the research effort. Only recently did the government begin to research the effect of low-level exposure to chemicals. And I didn't even have it in their protocols early on as to whether a soldier might have to their belief, come encounter with certain chemical exposure. And third, require a presidential finding of need before ever again permitting the use of experimental drugs on our troops. I think this is the one that I find the most difficult. I was in fact speaking to one of your contemporaries, someone in the news media, who said that when he was in the Persian Gulf, he was ordered to take the PB pill, the experimental drug. It's used for other facts, but it's not used in this way as it was used in the Persian Gulf, to be used to ward off exposure to chemical and to lessen the impact of chemical. It was an experimental drug. Our troops were literally under order to take them, and if they didn't, they broke an order and could have been court-martialed. At the very least, the record should have been kept of who, what soldiers took them, and when, and how often. And in the future, we are going to require that the president sign off on any practice like this. Let me at this time refer you to Mr. Sanders, Ed Towns, the ranking member. And I do want to say, I know that the media can get a little tired of our congratulating each other, but this has been a bipartisan effort. And when I call Mr. Towns to the dais, who helped in drafting this report and all the hearings, I do so not as ranking member, but really as an equal in this process. Mr. Towns?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I won't congratulate you. What I would like to do, though, is just say that this is a tripartisan, not a bipartisan. It's a tripartisan. I'm a Democrat, and of course, Congressman Shays is a Republican, and Bernie Sanders is an independent. So I think that's a tripartisan report. As a ranking Democratic member of the subcommittee, I came away with the feeling that illnesses of the Persian Gulf veterans should be examined and treated. Research should be continued and compensation should be provided to those individuals whose Persian Gulf service has rendered them disabled or suffering from chronic illnesses, I believe that the veterans of the Persian Gulf War deserve care, compensation, and compassion. As we listen to the veterans and people who came before us over the past 19 months, we've had 11 hearings, and to listen to the kind of things that they said and how they were sort of ignored and sort of pushed around in many instances, we felt that we had to get to the bottom of this, and of course we spent a lot of time and effort on doing that. So I am supporting this report because I believe that the report provides additional direction and goal clarification for the Department of Veteran Affairs and the Department of Defense. I do not believe that this report should be seen as negative. It should be viewed that something needs to be done now. Instead, this committee's mandated oversight authority, we're charged with the responsibility of making that known. This is what we have done here, and this is the results of the hard work of the committee. I believe that the agencies can now take this report, understand our perspectives, and move forward in accomplishing the goals that we have set for them. Hopefully, the publication of this report will move us from the blame game and move us into the healing game. Finally, I hope this report paints a sharp picture of the lack of accountability which occurs during the time of war. If we learn anything from the Gulf War, hopefully, we should learn that the accountability is the cornerstone of democracy and cannot be abandoned even during the time of war. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Towns. At this time, Vince Snowbarger, who is the Vice Chairman of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might say that I come to these hearings on a little different foot than my colleagues. Coming in as a freshman this year, most of the hearings had been held over the last year. What I can tell you, though, is that in my short period of time serving on the committee and in these hearings, it became very, very clear to me and to my freshman colleagues that there was a true lack of accountability here, both for the Department of Defense and for the Veterans Administration. For more than 5 years, the Department of Defense maintained that not a single American was exposed to Iraqi chemical weapons during or after the ground war. And whether that chemical exposure was caused by the release of chemical agents during the destruction of Qamishiyya, or whether it was they were exposed to chemical weapons during the wartime aggression, is totally irrelevant. The fact of the matter was the Department of Defense knew that there was exposure and they had an obligation to inform American troops. After 5 years of denial, finally, last year, they admitted that 400 soldiers had been exposed to these chemical agents. And then a few months later, it was up to 20,000. And a few months after that, the AP reported it was 130,000 American troops exposed. Now, we don't know exactly how many, but clearly, the Department of Defense credibility has suffered as a result of their gradual and grudging admission that these soldiers were actually exposed. The VA has also taken a very lax approach. Many of the veterans that came to VA for treatment were treated with skepticism and with disdain, and it's clear that the VA's treatment and care of our Gulf War veterans is shameful. I think this is the first step that we've needed to take in trying to solve the Gulf War. It's been a very appropriate use of the oversight process of Congress. I think now the next step is to follow through on the recommendations and make sure that treatment is actually given to our Gulf War veterans for the symptoms that the suffering that they've had during this period of time. And I thank the chairman.
Thank the gentleman, and as pointed out, the independent member of Congress, Bernie Sanders, is now going to speak to you. I would like to say that I think all of us think of ourselves as independents.
Thank you, Chris. I just want to say a few words. It seems to me that the bottom line of this whole issue is the following. Today, there are some 70,000 men and women who served in the Gulf War who are suffering from one or another ailment that we refer to as Gulf War illness, including hundreds in my own state of Vermont. And if you go to the VA and you go to the DOD today and you say, what is the cause of the illness that tens of thousands of Americans are suffering from, they will say, we don't know. And if you say to them, what kind of treatment have you developed to improve the lives of these people and solve their medical problems, the VA and the DOD will say, we don't know. And it seems to me that after 6 years, what the Congress must say to the Department of Defense and the VA, thank you very much for your efforts in attempting to understand the causes of Gulf War illness, in attempting to develop a treatment, but you failed. And we think 6 years is enough, and we think we must go to another agency which perhaps will do a better job in trying to understand the problem and develop a treatment. And that's what it is about. It seems to me, as Chris and others have said, that this is not the end of the road, this is the beginning of the road. And we're going into new territory, but I would hope very much that the committee and the whole Congress will work in a nonpartisan way to make sure that we finally bring together those scientists in the private sector and academia, those scientists who are working in the government together under the leadership of a new agency to say, let us do a better job in understanding the cause of this problem. Let's get a treatment going as soon as possible. Let's marshal all of our resources. We can do no less. So I congratulate Chris for his outstanding leadership. We look forward to the process.
I've had a great committee, and all four of us are happy to answer any question you might have.
Mr. Chase, do you feel like you guys found the answer to the mystery of Gulf War disease?
I think we have established the fact that various chemical exposures, the pesticides, the vaccines, basically this cesspool of chemicals is clearly a cause of Gulf War syndrome. There's not one silver bullet. But we know without a shadow of a doubt that the records that would substantiate what soldiers took what pills, what soldiers were in what area, what chemicals were in those areas, those records did exist, but don't exist now. And therefore, we have to give the presumption to our veterans because they can't rely on documents that have been destroyed.
Don't your findings vary from the independent White House commission that was set up to do the same thing?
Well, let me just say to you that we're not in competition with the President's Advisory Committee on Gulf War illnesses. I think all of us could speak to our disappointment when they issued a report basically saying that, in so many words, our soldiers' problems were psychological and not physical. And I'd welcome others just addressing
Let me just say a word. I don't think, as Chris indicated, that we think that there's a silver bullet or one magical answer. But I think what this report indicates that the problem is far more complicated than just calling Gulf War illness a stress-related illness. I think that is absolutely the case, and I think that's perhaps one of the major achievements of this report. Stress is, in fact, in my judgment, an important factor. But the issue is what happens when people under stress receive pyridostigmine bromide, receive different vaccines, when they are exposed to all kinds of pollutants. What happens in terms of the synergistic effect? And I think that's the strength of what the report is, that I think we can all conclusively agree that stress alone is not the cause of Gulf War illness.
From here, do you intend or hope that President Clinton takes the initiative to shift this out of VA and DOD, or I mean, obviously it'll have to come through Congress, or will you take that initiative? Who's going to do that next?
Collectively, we will be going to our own leadership. Republican, Democrat, we will be going to the White House with our report. This is a report that we want to have looked at seriously because we think we have some very constructive findings and recommendations. And ultimately, we're talking about research as it relates to the VA and DOD. We want it under the control of someone other than the DOD and VA, but they obviously are going to continue to do their research, and they're obviously going to be helping and working to heal our soldiers. Our soldiers are still going to go to the VA. But in terms of just the recalcitrance of the bureaucracy, One on finding 9, and this is just one of our findings. We say acute diagnosis of veterans' illnesses remains difficult due to inadequate or missing personnel medical records, missing toxic detection logs, and unreleased classified documents. I've been in possession of these documents almost since they were established in 1994. I have gone to senators, I have gone to chairmen of committees to have them look at these documents and release them. One is Defense Hotline allegations regarding fielding of chemical protective masks. Another is called Quick Reaction Report Reliability, the M17 series and M14 chemical protective masks. I can basically say to you that these call into question the effectiveness of the masks that our soldiers took. This is just one example of something our veterans need to be able to see. If they use these masks, they still have a right to know how effective they were. And I can't release this report. I have pleaded with Mr. Rosker to see that these are released. He said he would see that it was done, and he didn't. And this is just one example of many that our veterans have a right of information they have a right to know.
The records were destroyed. How were the records destroyed?
Others want to speak to that, or do you want me to?
Go ahead.
Records, we had testimony that some records were just simply destroyed, not considered valuable. We have 3/4 of the chemical, biological, and nuclear documents they can't find 3/4 of them. The irony is that the DOD can find documents that prove their case, or not prove it, but substantiate, but can't find documents that would prove the arguments of the veterans. And yet we had testimony from people in the Fox equipment. Now, what happened was that it's very clear that none of the detection systems went off before the war. They went off thousands, hundreds and hundreds during the war. These were not calibrated finely, as DOD has told us. But the argument was, why during the war and not before the war if they weren't reliable? But then, in some cases, we had testimony from 2 individuals in Fox equipment. Fox equipment is equipment you're in, you don't get out of, that makes very fine readings. And we had testimony from trained personnel that they detected chemical weapons. The use of, it's not weapons, but the exposure of chemicals. And the Army just said, well, they're wrong. But they can't find the information. They've lost the documents that these soldiers swear that they had seen and helped find and put into the system. And their documents aren't now available. Well, that to me is an outrage, but is frankly very typical.
Are you saying that is intentional?
Who knows?
I mean,
I can't say it's intentional. No, I can't say it's intentional. All I can say is it is a gigantic curiosity to some of us in the committee why some documents can be found that are helpful to the DOD's position, which basically is that our troops weren't exposed to chemicals. Not to give credit to one program, but 60 Minutes had Mr. Deutsch on, where he said, and I loved his wording, there was no offensive use of chemicals. We have no knowledge of offensive use. How wonderful a statement. Camisea was defensive. We destroyed Camisea. Now, the CIA had documentation early on, before the war. In '89, the chemicals were there. They knew after the war that we had destroyed this depot. And the only way that the DOD, just so you know why we sometimes become a little suspicious, we had testimony from Brian Martin on a Tuesday. Brian Martin, a staff sergeant. He had a film of Camisea because he was there when they blew it up. And he had a film of the plumes. He had a film of some of the rockets and shells that documented that chemicals were there. When DOD learned that we had this testimony, at 12 on a Friday, they announced at 4 o'clock on Friday they would have a press conference to acknowledge that only 400, that not only, but 400 of our soldiers were exposed to chemicals. Well, we then subsequently found that the plumes didn't go up in the air and fall down. They went 12, 15, and 20 miles out. And that doesn't even address the immense number of biological and chemical plants that we bombed from the air. And in all the studies, we were told the plumes would go away from our troops, not towards. And that's getting to this issue now of how many have been exposed because the plumes went towards our troops.
How much
What you're seeing, do you think, has been intentional acts in terms of the information not coming out? And how much of it do you think is just simply that people, the bureaucracy is stumbled?
Probably nobody in the world knows that answer. But let me just say two things. Pick up the point that Chris was making. There is no question in, I think, any of our minds that the DOD and the CIA have been absolutely horrendous in terms of being forthcoming, for whatever reason, about the problems. It is not acceptable that in the beginning they virtually denied there was a problem. You remember that? Oh, there is no problem. Oh, then I guess there is a problem, but the problem is stress-related. Certainly no chemicals played a role. Oh, none whatsoever. Well, maybe a few hundred troops might have been exposed. Well, maybe it was 20,000. Well, I guess we think it's 100,000. And on, and it was like pulling teeth. That is half the problem. And Chris is absolutely right. The other half of the problem is, be that as it may, we need to understand the cause of Gulf War illness. If tomorrow the DOD came forward and did a fantastic job in detailing every single aspect of what occurred, that would be great. But you know what? That still might not give us the cause of the illness or an effective treatment. So we've got to move forward in two separate ways. And as Chris said, we have got to continue to pull out information. We've got to hold those people accountable who have not given us the information. But secondly, let us not take our eyes off the prize. And the prize is understanding the illness and developing a treatment so that we can restore some of those lives that have been so terribly wronged.
Can you detail for me exactly what the new agency will be expected to do?
You know, that is going to be the basis for our continued hearings. So, you know, we didn't quite know when to end the first phase and do a report and just continue on, because we kept finding more things to report. So we just arbitrarily said, this is the point. We're going to file our report, and it is substantive. And now we're going to the next stage. And that next stage will require us to recommend to Congress what agency should direct the research. I think Mr. Sanders has one recommendation that we would consider and might want to talk about it, and then we could talk to others.
Okay. I think the agency that we want is going to be an agency that has the courage to take a hard look at the recommendations in this report and say, yeah, we think that it is very likely that chemicals and pyridostigmine bromide have played a role in Gulf War illness. In the labor HHS legislation, with Chris's help and other people's help, we managed to get some language into the report which will direct over a 7-year period $7 million into the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. Okay? And we think that they have indicated and have told us that they are interested in pursuing that issue. So I think that's an area to maybe begin looking at. But as Chris indicated, we're going to have to take a hard look. But they are one agency that I think is a possibility. Pardon me? Within NIH, there is an institute called the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, led by Dr. Ken Olden.
How quickly do you think you can put together the presumptive legislation, and how would you assess its chances in House and Senate?
Let me just speak on, you want to speak on the first thing?
Well, no, I'm just going to sort of add, you know, I think that we want to be very careful as to how we move and when we move. We would need to get some additional information in before we could determine in terms of what really needs to happen. But we know for a fact that what is going on now needs to be fixed. And that's what we will try and do. But the point is that we will not do it, you know, very quickly, because we want to have some hearings to get additional information from people, experts out there, as to what really should happen. You know, we've discovered some things here which I think reminds me of what happens in the Board of Education, you know, where you have a school where you have all kinds of problems, and the principal will say there's no problems in our school, because if he admits to the fact, then it points out that I'm not a good principal, I'm not a good leader. So I think we see some of this coming out of here. So we need to make certain that what we do in terms of fixing this is that we don't make some of the mistakes that we've made in the past. So I would be one that would say, let us cautiously move. We know it has broken, it needs to be fixed, and we should fix it and make the kind of recommendations for that to happen with the input coming from experts.
You know, and I'd also say that, you know, say arbitrarily decided. We thought we were at a good point. If this report suggested who should take it over, that would be the focus of everybody's attention, and they would not focus on the first 18 findings and the first 18 recommendations. So, you know, that's another factor, but we're going to look at that. It relates to another point, though, the whole issue of environmental sciences and who is qualified. One of the most troubling things for me was in the course of asking the VA, who has background in chemical exposure, environmental sciences? How many doctors do you have? Because they have thousands. And they could only name one. And then they got back to us because we wanted to. And there were 4 toxicologists in the entire VA. Now, environmental sciences is an area that's fascinating to get into, and you would think the VA and the DoD would want to have tremendous expertise. In this whole issue of low-level exposure, as a former member of the state legislature, I voted on OSHA laws. I voted on laws that said people in the workplace shouldn't be exposed to low-level chemical exposure because it leads ultimately to chronic illness, which flew right in the face of what Mr. Joseph said to us from the Pentagon. He said low-level exposure doesn't lead to acute illness. And we had a gigantic disagreement there, and they backed off that. And they then said that will no longer be our presumption. That was one of the values of our hearing. But a point I want to make to you is that it's very clear to me that the Department of Defense cares very little about environmental science and what happens to our soldiers in the battlefield and before. Lindane was used to clean the Iraqi soldiers. We had a soldier who died in Connecticut who spent hours and hours every day in an enclosed tent without any ventilation, spraying troops, Iraqi troops, with Lindane. Now, he died of pancreas cancer, and people say, well, there's no relationship between the two. But we know that Lindane can't be used that way by a worker in American society because it's dangerous. And just one other area that we are going to focus in on, the depleted uranium. Our soldiers were not told that when they went into an Iraqi tank that was penetrated by a depleted uranium shell. This is a long spear that is harder than any other substance. It goes in and penetrates into a tank, and then it becomes a particle form. And that becomes highly dangerous. And our soldiers were not told about that. Now, Iraqis would like to say, candidly, the whole problem is depleted uranium. But there are a lot of issues that we have got to look at, and that's one of them, and that will continue our effort. But you had a question.
Yeah, what kind of a time frame are you on, and what kind of chances?
In terms of our recommendations?
And the legislation to establish presumption?
I will be working and having the legislation ready to go to start the beginning of the new calendar year legislative agenda. And we'll be going to our speaker and we'll be going to the minority leader to ask them to move forward on this.
Senator Rockefeller.
And the chairman of the relevant committees, of course.
Senator Rockefeller last week introduced some legislation that would take at least a few years to establish a presumption, working through the Department of Veterans Affairs, and could take several years to establish presumption. Are you willing to accept that kind of a time frame?
No, I'd like him to look at this report. He's done excellent work, and this is a team effort. But I think that when he, when he sees what we saw, the fact of the lost records, destroyed records, the recognition that soldiers can't prove their illnesses because the records don't exist, that we have a moral obligation to move much more quickly than a few years. Maybe some others would just speak on that issue.
I would just, Ed, did you want to?
No, I agree with the comment that was made. I think that, here again, that this report, and I've been in the Congress 16 years, and this report is very thorough. A lot of time and effort was put into it. And I think that once people get it and they read it and they see it, I think that the reaction is going to be different, even with the members of Congress. So I think that once they see it on the other side, then I think that they will understand the importance of really trying to move as fast as we possibly can, recognizing that we will have to have input coming, along the way. But I think this report can make a difference in terms of a lot of attitudes.
Treatment in the meantime. We've seen every time they start up one of these presidential commissions or Pentagon, does the roster thing, that's 2 years later.
Pentagon does the one?
The Pentagon establishes the new roster unit, the presidential commission. you all are now saying take the research away from them, put it somewhere else. Treatment in the meantime, letting these two agencies that you don't trust to do the research do the main treatment for these folks. What do we do in the meantime?
Let me make 2 points and pick up a point that Chris made a few moments ago, which may well be close to the root of the problem. It may well be that Gulf War, the problem that the VA and the DOD has had is that Gulf War illness is related to a new kind of problem that they have not dealt with before. In other words, if somebody got shot up or hit by shrapnel, probably the DOD and the VA may have the best processes in the entire world to treat those problems. That's what they have been trained to do. But as Chris indicated, what happens when you've been given pyridostigmine bromide, exposed to various types of pesticides, burning oil wells, and given certain vaccines? What is their background in dealing with that type of problem? Very, very little. So it seems to me that we want to go to those people who have the expertise in that area. Now, in terms of treatment, the good news, and there is some good news, is that there is research being done all over the country by serious scientists who have been talking about the synergistic impact that various chemicals might have in creating Gulf War illness. And it seems to me that we have got to have the courage to reach out and bring those people into the tent and not say, well, gee, I'm not quite so familiar with that one. There are doctors, even within the VA, who have been developing certain types of treatments called avoidance therapy based on their belief that chemicals played a role. They were kind of pushed out of the VA. It's not acceptable. Don't talk about that. We don't believe in that. It seems to me that we as a Congress, representing the American people, have the moral obligation to bring in anybody and everybody who is doing serious research and who is doing treatment protocols. Is everybody going to be right out there? I don't think so. But I think we've got to bring them in, we've got to welcome them in, and we've got to give them their day in the process. Up to this point, the VA and the DOD, frankly, have not done that. So I guess the main point that I'm making is let's open the door. People are hurting. We know that there are doctors out there who are developing various types of treatments. Are they effective or not? Let's bring them in and find out. Let's just not push them aside.
You all set here? Let me just conclude then by saying that the bottom line for this committee is that we want our troops properly diagnosed, we want them effectively treated, and we want them fairly compensated. And we want the research to be effective, and we want it to begin in more intensity, and we want it better coordinated, and we clearly do want it. The direction of the research will still be done in part by the VA and DOD, but the direction of the research handled by an agency other than those two that I mentioned. Thanks very much for coming.
No, don't worry.